Why do some men achieve extraordinary success while others with equal talent remain trapped in mediocrity? Why do brilliant minds get stuck at average levels, while lesser intellects soar to heights they seemingly don't deserve? The answer isn't talent, opportunity, or luck. It's something far more insidious and personal: the woman standing behind him. Here's the brutal truth that destroys the comfortable narrative about women supporting men's success. For every great woman who elevates a man to greatness, there are 10 who systematically drain his potential, sabotage his ambitions, and reduce his dreams to dust through psychological warfare disguised as love. The famous saying, "Behind every successful man stands a great woman," represents one of history's most dangerous lies. The complete truth would read, "Behind every successful man stands a great woman, or else he'd be even more successful." Most men never realize they're living with success saboteurs because the destruction happens slowly, subtly through thousands of small compromises that seem reasonable in isolation, but collectively represent the systematic dismantling of masculine potential. She doesn't attack his dreams directly. She doesn't forbid his ambitions explicitly. Instead, she creates an environment where pursuing greatness becomes psychologically impossible, where the energy required for achievement gets consumed by relationship management, where the focus necessary for excellence gets fractured by domestic drama. The mechanism is sophisticated and devastating. She transforms the home from a sanctuary that restores his energy into a drain that depletes it. She converts intimate conversation from inspiration and support into tedious explanation and justification. She turns his personal space into a battlefield where every item, every interest, every aspect of his identity becomes subject to her approval or elimination. Consider the doctor whose wife threw away his carefully collected articles, writings that inspired him, ideas that energized his thinking, intellectual treasures that connected him to his deeper purpose. To her they were clutter. To him they represented everything meaningful about his intellectual life. This wasn't about organization or cleanliness. This was psychological castration through the elimination of everything that made him who he was beyond his utility to her. She didn't just throw away papers. She threw away pieces of his soul, declaring that what mattered most to him mattered nothing to her. His response reveals the tragic reality of how successful men get neutralized. What could I say? What means everything to me means nothing to her. I said nothing. He didn't fight because he recognized the futility of explaining depth to someone who operates at surface level, meaning to someone who sees only function, inspiration to someone who values only convenience. The energy required to constantly defend your inner life from someone who shares your outer life is enormous. The psychological cost of justifying your deepest interests to someone who dismisses them as meaningless slowly erodes your connection to those interests themselves. You begin second-guessing the value of what inspires you. You start questioning whether your passions are really important or just selfish indulgences. You gradually abandon pieces of yourself to avoid the exhaustion of defending them against someone who's supposed to be your closest ally. This process operates so gradually that most men don't recognize what's happening until it's too late. They just notice that they feel less energetic, less motivated, less connected to their ambitious self. They attribute this to aging, stress, or life circumstances without recognizing that their domestic environment has become a success prevention system. The woman who stands in the way of masculine success operates through several key strategies that systematically undermine his potential for greatness. Understanding these patterns is crucial because they operate below the level of conscious awareness while producing devastating long-term effects. The first strategy is intellectual diminishment through disinterest and dismissal. She shows no curiosity about his professional world, his industry insights, his creative ideas, or his intellectual pursuits. When he tries to share what excites him professionally, she responds with polite disinterest or immediate topic changes to domestic concerns. This creates psychological isolation, where the man cannot share his deepest enthusiasms with his closest companion. The excitement that should be amplified through sharing instead gets dampened through indifference. The ideas that should be refined through discussion instead remain undeveloped due to lack of engagement. Over time, he stops trying to connect with her intellectually because the repeated experience of disinterest becomes too painful. This withdrawal protects him from rejection, but also disconnects him from a vital source of energy and inspiration, the ability to share intellectual passion with someone who matters to him. The second strategy is energy depletion, through emotional management requirements. She creates ongoing emotional situations that require his constant attention, mediation, and psychological resources. These aren't major crises that could be addressed definitively. They're chronic low-level dramas that consume his mental bandwidth continuously. She's unhappy with neighbors, dissatisfied with friends, frustrated with family members, overwhelmed by household decisions, confused by financial matters, stressed by social obligations. Each situation requires his input, his emotional labor, his problem-solving energy. None are serious enough to warrant major intervention, but together they create a constant demand for his psychological resources. The man who comes home to emotional chaos cannot access the mental clarity required for breakthrough thinking. The executive who spends evenings managing domestic drama cannot enter the focus state necessary for strategic planning. The creative professional who devotes mental energy to relationship maintenance has less available for innovative work. The third strategy is ambition dilution, through practical concerns elevation. She consistently redirects his attention from long-term vision to immediate practicalities. When he discusses future possibilities, she raises current limitations. When he explores growth opportunities, she emphasizes security concerns. When he considers bold moves, she focuses on potential risks. This isn't conscious sabotage. It's unconscious programming that prioritizes immediate security over long-term potential. But the cumulative effect is the gradual erosion of his visionary thinking and risk tolerance. He begins operating from her framework of limitation, rather than his framework of possibility. The man who repeatedly has his ambitious thinking redirected to practical concerns gradually loses his ability to think ambitiously. The neural pathways that generate breakthrough ideas atrophy from disuse. The psychological muscles required for great achievement weaken from constant focus on small concerns. The fourth strategy is identity erosion through interest elimination. She systematically removes, dismisses, or minimizes everything in his environment that connects him to his authentic self beyond his role as provider and partner. His books become clutter. His hobbies become waste of time. His interests become selfishness. His alone time becomes neglect of relationship. This process operates through the reasonable-sounding principle that mature relationships require shared priorities and mutual consideration. But when consistently applied, it results in the elimination of everything that makes him uniquely himself in favor of everything that makes him useful to her. The man whose individual interests get systematically eliminated gradually loses touch with the internal sources of energy and inspiration that fuel exceptional achievement. He becomes a functional unit in a domestic system, rather than a dynamic individual pursuing meaningful goals. The fifth strategy is social isolation through relationship centralization. She gradually becomes his primary social connection, reducing his exposure to other perspectives, challenges, and inspirations. Male friendships get complicated by her needs and preferences. Professional relationships become filtered through domestic obligations. Social activities get evaluated based on her comfort and interest levels. This isolation serves her need for centralized attention and control, while depriving him of the diverse input and challenge that stimulate growth and achievement. The man who only interacts with his wife intellectually and socially gradually adopts her limitations as his own boundaries. Men require exposure to other ambitious minds, competitive environments, and challenging perspectives to maintain their edge and drive. When domestic relationships become their primary intellectual diet, they slowly starve for the stimulation that generates exceptional thinking and bold action. The psychological profile of women who systematically undermine masculine potential reveals patterns that operate independently of conscious intention. These aren't necessarily bad women or deliberately destructive partners. They're often caring individuals whose unconscious programming creates environments hostile to male achievement. The success-sabotaging woman typically operates from deep insecurity about her own value and capabilities. She unconsciously recognizes that her partner's continued growth and success increase the likelihood that he'll outgrow his need for her. This creates biological programming that drives her to limit his development in ways that ensure her continued importance to his life. She doesn't consciously think, "I need to prevent his success to keep him." But her unconscious mind generates behaviors that serve this function, creating dependency through emotional management needs, ensuring relevance through problem creation, maintaining control through interest elimination. The more potential a man has for extraordinary achievement, the more threatened her unconscious programming becomes. The doctor with empire-building capability represents exactly the kind of threat that activates female limitation strategies. His potential for greatness triggers her programming to ensure he remains manageable. This dynamic explains why some of the most capable men end up with the most limiting women. It's not coincidence. It's unconscious biological programming that recognizes high-potential males as requiring more intensive control strategies to prevent abandonment or replacement. The intellectual stagnation that characterizes success. Sabotaging women isn't accidental, it's functional. A woman who continues growing intellectually and developing her own capabilities doesn't need to limit her partner's growth to maintain relevance. But a woman whose own development has stagnated requires her partner's stagnation to maintain equilibrium. The woman who hasn't changed her conversation, interests, or worldview in years creates an environment where growth and development feel foreign and uncomfortable. She unconsciously pressures her partner to operate at her level, rather than challenging herself to rise to his. This intellectual flatlining serves her psychological need for predictability and control, while creating a ceiling on the relationship's potential for inspiring either partner to greatness. The man who could achieve extraordinary things gradually accepts ordinary thinking as normal, because extraordinary thinking feels disruptive to domestic harmony. The conversation patterns that develop between ambitious men and limiting women reveal the mechanism through which potential gets neutralized. Instead of intellectual exchange that stimulates new thinking, conversation becomes repetitive coverage of domestic concerns, social gossip, and emotional processing. The man who once engaged in idea exploration, strategic thinking, and creative problem-solving finds himself discussing household logistics, relationship dynamics, and other people's problems. His mental energy gets directed toward managing existing situations rather than creating new possibilities. This conversational diet gradually changes his thinking patterns. The neural pathways that generate breakthrough insights atrophy from disuse. The intellectual muscles required for visionary thinking weaken from constant focus on mundane concerns. The man who spends his intimate time explaining basic concepts rather than exploring advanced ideas gradually loses his capacity for advanced thinking. The executive who comes home to elementary conversation gradually loses his edge for sophisticated analysis. The domestic environment becomes either a launching pad that amplifies a man's potential or a landing strip that grounds his ambitions. The limiting woman creates an environment that feels comfortable precisely because it requires no growth, challenge, or development from either partner. But comfort is the enemy of achievement. The man who becomes too comfortable in his domestic environment loses the psychological tension that drives exceptional performance. He begins optimizing for domestic peace rather than professional excellence, relationship maintenance rather than goal achievement. The most tragic aspect of this dynamic is how gradually it operates. The man doesn't wake up one day to discover his ambitions have been eliminated. He slowly adjusts to smaller and smaller versions of his original vision until mediocrity feels like success. He doesn't recognize that he's chosen domestic harmony over professional excellence because each individual compromise seems reasonable. But the accumulated effect is the transformation of a potential titan into a comfortable suburban husband whose greatest aspiration is avoiding conflict at home. The financial implications of success sabotage extend far beyond individual achievement to family wealth and security. The woman who limits her partner's potential doesn't just affect his personal satisfaction. She reduces the family's economic potential for generations, The doctor who could have built a medical empire but settles for a modest practice due to domestic limitations doesn't just sacrifice his own potential. He sacrifices his family's financial future. The executive who could have launched a successful company but remains a comfortable employee due to home pressures doesn't just limit his own income. He eliminates generational wealth creation. The limiting woman often justifies her sabotage through concerns about security and stability. But her focus on preserving current comfort often prevents the bold actions that create lasting security. She optimizes for short-term predictability while eliminating long-term prosperity. The most successful men throughout history have required partners who amplified rather than diminished their ambitions. The great woman behind a successful man doesn't just support his existing goals. She challenges him to set bigger goals, pursue bolder visions, and maintain higher standards. She becomes his intellectual equal and creative partner, rather than his domestic manager and emotional drain. She understands his professional world well enough to contribute meaningful insights rather than requiring constant explanation of basic concepts. Most importantly, she maintains her own growth and development to avoid becoming a limitation on his potential. She recognizes that keeping pace with an ambitious man requires continuous self-improvement rather than efforts to slow his progress to her level. The choice facing ambitious men is stark. Accept domestic limitations that ensure mediocrity, or insist on partnerships that support excellence. This often means choosing solitude over companionship until finding a woman capable of matching rather than limiting their potential. But the cost of choosing limitation over achievement extends beyond personal satisfaction to professional impact, financial potential, and legacy creation. The man who accepts intellectual diminishment in exchange for domestic peace often discovers that the peace itself becomes hollow when purchased at the cost of his authentic self. The woman who truly loves a man's potential rather than just his current utility works to become worthy of his highest aspirations rather than working to reduce those aspirations to her comfort level. She understands that greatness requires support, not sabotage, challenge rather than limitation, inspiration instead of explanation. Understanding these dynamics protects ambitious men from the unconscious programming that transforms successful women into success saboteurs. It also reveals why some of the most capable men remain mysteriously underachieving despite obvious talent and opportunity. The workplace provides a perfect parallel for understanding how limitation operates in domestic contexts. Imagine an executive whose assistant constantly interrupts important meetings with trivial concerns, redirects strategic conversations to administrative details, and fills his calendar with low-priority activities that prevent focus on high-impact decisions. That assistant would be fired immediately because her behavior directly undermines his effectiveness. Yet men tolerate identical patterns from wives who interrupt creative thinking with domestic concerns, redirect ambitious conversations to practical limitations, and fill their mental bandwidth with relationship management tasks. The difference is that firing an incompetent assistant is professionally acceptable, while addressing limitation in marriage is socially condemned. Men are expected to accommodate domestic interference with their professional development, while maintaining the fiction that such accommodation represents love and commitment. The biological programming that drives female limitation strategies operates through several unconscious mechanisms that serve evolutionary functions, but create modern relationship dysfunction. Women evolved in environments where male success could mean abandonment, replacement, or resource redirection away from them and their offspring. This created psychological programming that automatically activates limitation strategies. When men show potential for significant growth or achievement, the more capable the man, the more intensive the unconscious sabotage becomes. Her biology interprets his potential greatness as a threat to her security rather than an opportunity for mutual benefit. Modern women inherit this programming despite living in environments where male success typically benefits rather than threatens female welfare. But unconscious mechanisms don't adapt quickly to changed circumstances. They continue operating according to ancient priorities that often conflict with contemporary realities. The woman who unconsciously limits her partner's potential isn't evil or calculating. She's responding to biological imperatives that evolved over millions of years. Understanding this programming prevents men from taking limitation personally, while helping them recognize patterns that require strategic rather than emotional responses. The addiction aspect of limitation relationships deserves specific attention because it explains why capable men often remain trapped in dynamics that obviously harm their potential. The limiting woman creates intermittent reinforcement schedules that make her approval psychologically addictive. She provides just enough support and encouragement to keep him hoping for more, while consistently undermining his confidence and ambition through criticism and indifference.